I've made no secret of it before that I'm very sympathetic to more ecological ways of looking at the world. I'm sympathetic to the perspectives of movements like deep ecology. And you might think that then I would be sympathetic to the kind of green politics we see in the modern West. The many green parties across Europe that are growing in popularity, especially among younger people. But this is certainly very far from what I'd like to see, because the green parties we see in the West are basically this kind of green politics is basically liberalism with carbon taxes, and it's fundamentally opposed to a natural and ecological way of seeing the world, of being in the world. And you see this in the political debates. There's many of them ongoing now in my own country, where the Green parties say that we need to do things like lower our carbon emissions by 7% every year, but they don't set out a clear way of doing that. And they at the same time engage in all the same auction politics of the parties they're competing with. They still promise GDP growth, they still promise more investment in the health service, more investment in education. They still promise that everyone will get wealthier every year, that more jobs will be created. And at the same time, they promise that there will be huge levels of immigration into Ireland. The Green Party here has said that the Irish population should reach 10 million people, which would be a doubling of the current population. And so they run into this problem where, on the one hand, they're talking about the crisis the earth faces, but on the other hand, they're unwilling to move away from the promise of greater wealth and greater productivity for everyone. And in a sense, part of that isn't really their fault. They have to engage in election politics, and maybe this is more a problem of electoral democracy. No one is going to get elected going before people telling them that the world is overpopulated, that we need to deindustrialize or lower our productivity, or any of these things, that we enjoy luxuries that we basically have no right to enjoy, and we need to get used to tougher ways of living. So that's more a problem of electoral politics. But there's a fundamental problem in the worldview of this green politics. And that promise of continued growth of the economy and the population, that's just one aspect of it. But the fundamental problem of green politics is it's still a form of liberalism. And liberalism is humanism. That is, it's anthropocentric. It's based on this anthropocentric Enlightenment worldview. It's based on this idea that man is something separate from nature and can extricate himself from the laws of nature. And you see this in the rhetoric of Green Party politics. Man is described as a steward of nature rather than an integral part of it. Nature is something we have to look after. Nature is something that we have to maintain. But not so much for its intrinsic goodness, not so much to preserve the natural order, so much as because it's good for us. And so they'll always frame their arguments in terms of, well, you know, if we move away from a carbon-based economy, if we move to these things, if we have a more renewable way of living, then it'll be better for our future on the planet. So it's still fundamentally an anthropocentric worldview. It still fundamentally sees nature as Heidegger would describe it as stand in reserve, as something that we take from, but it wants it to be renewable stand in reserve, and it wants there to be more long-term output there for, you know, our own future. But because it's a form of liberalism, the big problem of green politics is it doesn't really have a position from which to critique the current system, because the current system is built around all these unnatural ways of living, including multiculturalism. And, you know, modern capitalism, global homo capitalism, is the finest example of these unnatural modes of living. But you don't get critiques of that system from green politics. Instead, you'll get them demanding diversity quotas, demanding more feminism, demanding LGBT rights, etc., etc. And so their fundamental ethic that overrides any ecological concerns, their fundamental ethic is still humanism and liberalism, and this idea of individual rights and everyone, no matter what their background, actualizing themselves And so they marry their green ethic to all these sort of postmodern forms of hyper relativistic individualism. And these two things are fundamentally, or should be fundamentally, opposed. And so you get an ethic and a politics of green parties that, on a fundamental level, don't make sense. And what they turn into is basically a reflection of what we see in this kind of conscientious capitalism. You know, there's a search engine, the name escapes me, that tells you can plant trees by using it instead of Google. Every time you search on this, it contributes to them planting trees. Slavoj Žižek has talked about this, that you go to Starbucks and you buy your coffee in the knowledge that a part of it is going to promoting sustainable farming and giving a fair wage to the farmers that farm the coffee beans. And so we always see this, that capitalism builds into itself the means for cleansing yourself of the guilt of engaging in it. And green politics in the West today is kind of a form of that. Just as Starbucks or some big multinational chain will put a small raise on the price of your coffee so you can feel good about buying it. The Green Party will put on a carbon tax or some other small measure that basically tinkers with the specifics of capitalism and maintains the long-term stability and efficiency of it without fundamentally asking for any kind of change in consciousness that that kind of global homo capitalism is embedding in us. And, a further reflection of the fact that green politics is basically just a political form of this is that all of their social values are identical to the corporations and the people that are at the top of modern capitalism. It's the exact same ethic, postmodern relativism and nihilism. And so, it is kind of anti-human in the unnatural political forms it proposes, but it's still starting from this humanist, anthropocentric, liberal perspective. It's not radical. It's not proposing a return to nature. It's not proposing a new way of being in the world that would fundamentally change our relationship with nature. It just wants to appeal to sustainability, and it just wants to tinker with the system to make it more sustainable. But there's a more fundamental point in pointing out that the people that promote green politics also promote these incompatible, unnatural ways of living. And that is that true ecological movements, true ecological perspectives start with a rejection of the desacralizing of nature that's been done in the modern world, and through whatever form they find a way to reconceptualize our place in the world and to return to seeing nature as divine. And in a certain sense, they re-sacralize nature. And if you want to see examples of that, if you want to see examples of a more radical ecology that is fundamentally transformative and is fundamentally opposed to the modern ethic, you could look at something like modern European paganism that very much starts from the perspective of taking nature as divinity. But even something like a movement in the late 20th century, deep ecology, most of them started from the philosophy of Spinoza, this kind of all-embracing pantheism that sees nature as an all-encompassing whole and sees that holistic harmony as perfection. And so there is a need in rejecting the modern instrumentalist view of nature to find a more traditionalist view to juxtapose that to. One that re-sacralizes nature, that returns a mystical element to nature, because it is that mystical element that is necessary to give intrinsic value to nature. And a good capture of this kind of mystical understanding of nature, this kind of trans-rational mystical state of consciousness that is advocated for in all religious traditions, is in the Bhagavad Gita. It's written that the true yogis, uniting their consciousness with God, see with equal eye all living beings in God and God in all living beings. And so this might seem radical to our modern sensibilities, but on a fundamental level, any transformation of our relationship with the natural world is going to require a fundamental transformation in our own consciousness and a reconceptualizing of nature as a whole. That is, as a whole, the manifestation of a spiritual absolute. But within green politics and the people that lead green political movements, they're very much, upper middle class, sort of enlightened atheist types that are very far away from those kind of modes of thought and are much more attached to modern kind of scientific reasoning, this kind of Neil deGrasse Tyson like wonder and awe at the universe because of how many atoms and planets there are, and it's just so mind blowing. And they're very far away from any conception or understanding of divinity, and so they can never place their ecological understanding in those kinds of terms. It still has to be in this kind of anthropocentric enlightenment rationalism way, and that fundamentally isn't a break at all from our modern understanding of the world. And if someone wants to promote a more ecological way of understanding the world in which all life has intrinsic value and which diversity of life is an intrinsic value, then that is fundamentally incompatible with the liberal view that natural ways of living are basically a form of oppression, and that the goal of human progress is to sort of extricate ourselves from the determinations of nature by creating enough productivity that we can then live off that productive surplus, that we can then live these degenerate hedonistic lifestyles free from the determination of nature. So any ecological perspective has to start with a complete rejection of humanism and its political form of liberalism and its modern outgrowth of global capitalism. And it would also find a destruction of the kinds of intrinsic values that we should be looking for everywhere in the modern world. And, the finest example of that is, a Green Party that will promote mass immigration and multiculturalism. But as I think Morgoth's review pointed out before, there's a great tragedy in taking men from the hills of Pakistan or North India, where they could be and should be, shepherds or whatever traditional way of life they could be living there, and putting them in tower blocks in London to work in a convenience store. There's a great tragedy there, and that is the kind of tragedy and contradiction of the modern world that any green politics, that anyone advocating an ecological perspective should be attacking the most. It's this dehumanizing, unnatural, anti-nature system that turns people into cogs in this machine of techno-capitalism. But you won't find a critique of that within green politics. You'll just find the same old identity politics, promotion of multiculturalism, and fundamentally green politics is just a defense of liberalism. It's just a part of liberalism that says to the rest of liberalism, we need to tinker here and there to make this system overall more sustainable, so that in the future we can continue bringing contraception to the third world, and we can continue bringing third worlders into our own countries. And so you'll never get any kind of change in consciousness coming out of green politics. And just to finish off, the finest example of that is in these debates you'll hear the leader of the Green Party talking about the tragedy of people spending many hours commuting to their jobs in the city, and that he'd like to bring in public transport to make their commutes easier. And that's a fine idea, there's nothing wrong with that. That's something that gets ignored, the amount of time people lose commuting, how sort of anti-human our modern economy is. But the problem is he'll critique it from that standpoint, but he won't go so as far as to criticize the fact that they're going to spend 9 hours in a pod working for Google or Amazon or PayPal. That's not a problem to him, because still fundamentally he bases his growth model on multinational corporations and on making the country the best possible servant for international capitalism. And so, that is the standpoint from which we should be critiquing the modern world. It's the fact that it sends us to work 9-10 hours in a pod for some international capitalists living thousands of miles away. It shouldn't just be this tinkering with the system where we make public transport cheaper or we pull out more bus routes. It has to be more fundamental than that. And you won't find that in green politics. Green politics is just another form of liberalism.